In the 2010s, thousands of elderly British citizens who had lived and worked in the UK for over half a century were suddenly locked out of their own lives. They were denied NHS healthcare, fired from their jobs, held in detention centers, and in some cases, deported to countries they hadn't seen since they were children. The official government explanation was that this was a terrible administrative accident, a massive, unforeseen bureaucratic mistake. But the independent inquiry, led by Wendy Williams, identified a glaring paradox. If this were a random clerical error, the victims would have been a statistical cross-section of the entire British population. Instead, the damage was felt almost exclusively by Black Britons. A filing error doesn't select for a specific demographic. When an administrative failure targets one community with this level of precision, the cause is systemic rather than accidental. The archives at Lunar House hold the internal memos and legal drafting that predate the modern Home Office. These records show that the 2018 crisis was the logical outcome of a policy framework built piece by piece over 60 years. The legal baseline begins in 1948, the year the Empire Windrush docked in Essex. Under the British Nationality Act of that same year, the people stepping off that ship were citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies. They were British subjects with the exact same legal rights to live and work in the country as someone born in the middle of London. To solve a massive post-war labor shortage, the government spent the late 1940s actively recruiting 345,000 white European refugees to help rebuild the nation's infrastructure. This visualization compares the UK's differing approaches to inbound labor. While European workers were met with welcoming funnels and English language training, officials monitored the arrival of Caribbean citizens with alarm. Internal Home Office reports from the early 1950s explicitly focused on the skin color of these new arrivals, launching campaigns to deter their travel and raising ticket prices to block their entry. The government needed colonial labor to rebuild the economy, but worked internally to prevent those same Black citizens from settling permanently. By the late 1950s, the political mandate was to stop non-white immigration, but doing so explicitly would undermine the global image of the British Empire. Under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, officials began drafting solutions that would look neutral on paper while achieving specific demographic results. The 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act introduced a system where colonial citizens could only enter if they had a specific employment voucher. Because British industry frequently practiced racial discrimination in hiring, the voucher system acted as a proxy to filter out non-white applicants. In 1968, when Asian citizens holding UK passports fled persecution in Kenya, the government rushed through new legislation in a single week. To block them, the new law required arrivals to prove they had a UK-born parent or grandparent. Prime Minister Edward Heath carried this logic further with the 1971 Immigration Act, which introduced the legal concept of the patrial. This logic tree shows how the law redefined citizenship. The standard shifted from territory, where you were born, to ancestry. A white colonial citizen from Canada was highly likely to have a British-born grandparent, passing the test. A Black colonial citizen from the Caribbean was not. This change meant that the Windrush generation living in Britain saw their status shift. They remained in the country, but the legal standard protecting them was replaced by a more precarious residency status. Without using racial language in the text of the law, the definition of Britishness was rewritten to focus on ancestral bloodlines. Margaret Thatcher's government moved to resolve the citizenship debate permanently with the 1981 British Nationality Act. This law abolished the old category of citizenship that the Windrush generation had traveled under. Those affected were given 5 years to officially register as Commonwealth citizens. If they did not register by the end of 1987, they would lose their automatic right to remain in the UK. However, an official Home Office leaflet from 1987 advised these citizens that registration was optional. It stated, "If you have the right to register but you do not want to, you do not have to. Your position under the immigration laws is not changed." By following this official advice, thousands of people remained with the very documents that would eventually determine their right to stay. They became undocumented without their knowledge. 30 years later, the government implemented the hostile environment, a policy requiring landlords, employers, and doctors to check the digital and physical papers of everyone in the country. This new requirement collided with the legacy of the 1981 Act. The Windrush generation couldn't produce the papers required for 21st century survival because the government had spent decades changing the rules of who was required to hold them. To label the resulting crisis a bureaucratic error is to ignore 40 years of legislative history. The outcome in the 2010s was built on the choices made in 1962, 1968, 1971, and 1981. Immigration laws carry the weight of a country's history. When a bureaucratic system operates without historical memory, it can quietly erase the rights of its own citizens.